The European summit with President Zelensky, organised by Keir Starmer, has come out with one key message. It has to re-engage the United States in a positive way. Meanwhile, the Trump administration voices have amped up in the Putin-aligned attempt to have Zelensky removed as Ukrainian president and to continue to smooth away to a lucrative arrangement with Putin's Russia. Something's got to give, you would think. Indeed it has. Yesterday, I talked about what Keir Starmer was clearly seeking to achieve with the European summit, and that was largely borne out by how it all went. Starmer and Macron, also joined then by Europe's best pro-Ukraine Trump whisperer, Giorgia Meloni, set out that they needed to prove to Donald Trump that Europe is part of the solution, not part of the problem. Starmer was very alive to the optics, clear that this summit, where Zelensky had been welcomed warmly immediately after having had the huge Oval Office meltdown, must not be seen as Europe standing against Trump. According to British officials talking to the Financial Times, Starmer was at pains to make it clear to Trump in a phone call on Saturday night that the summit was not a case of Europe trying to gang up on him, but instead it was Europe standing up to play its part on Trump's behalf, hoping that will lead to the better angels of Trump's nature to come to the fore. As I suggested it would be, the plan involves France and Britain, and now Italy as well, becoming champions for an alternative plan to Washington. In concrete terms, Britain's Starmer and France's Macron have promised a UK-French-led force to provide reassurance in the event of a ceasefire, and are urging other European countries to join a, quote, coalition of the willing. The Financial Times dryly noted, so far there has hardly been a stampede to help. The coalition of the willing but unable, one wag joked. But such a force would be unviable unless the US provided a backstop, by which is practically meant air cover and surveillance to protect the troops on the ground. Reportedly, Starmer is somewhat frustrated right now that Europe's leaders have been quick to jump onto social media to publicly criticise Trump after the events at the White House, which he feels is not helping the cause. They need instead, he feels, to start showing the White House that they have the will to take responsibility for their own backyard. One Starmer ally is quoted as saying, "What Ukraine needs now is guns and butter. It doesn't need people tweeting and virtue signalling." Of course, none of this has a chance of succeeding. Well, I suppose I could just end the sentence right there. But none of this has a chance of succeeding if the US administration has already firmly and irrevocably thrown its weight into Putin's Russia as the partner of choice. Looking at the, I suppose you could call it the anti-virtue signalling that members of the administration were doing, they were clearly aligned with one of Putin's short-term goals, which is the removal of President Zelensky from the playing board. So Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, told CNN this:
"We need a leader that can deal with us, eventually deal with the Russians, and end this war. And if it becomes apparent that President Zelensky's either personal motivations or political motivations are divergent from ending the fighting in his country, then I think we have a real issue on our hands."
House Speaker Mike Johnson played the same tune on NBC's Meet the Press.
Either he needs to come to his senses and come back to the table in gratitude, or someone else needs to lead the country to do that.
This fixation with the idea that Zelensky needs to keep saying thank you, even to the administration that has embraced the dictator and invaded his country, and has so far done nothing to support Ukraine at all. Sort of reminds me of something. What is it?
Thank you, sir. May I have another? Thank you, sir. May I have another?
Oh yeah, Faintly disturbing. Anyway, the principle here is that if the US administration can make the case that they can't deal with Zelensky, so if Ukraine wants the bountiful support of the US, then it's going to need to replace him, then maybe they hope that pragmatism will force them to do what they want. That position is only undermined by two things. One, the Trump administration doesn't seem inclined to give something that would actually merit that degree of sacrifice. And two, there's no mechanism to make it happen anyway. Ukraine constitutionally can't have an election in the middle of a war of invasion. Some of the attacks went deeper into the Western alliance, full stop. So Tulsi Gabbard, who you'll remember is now the Director of National Intelligence, she suggested on Fox News Sunday that European countries that supported Zelensky after the White House incident are, quote, not committed to the cause and values of freedom. And Elon Musk responded to one tweet saying it was now time for the United States to leave NATO and the United Nations, just saying the word yes. The idea that the summit in London was NATO meeting without the US, and therefore the US should take offence in the trademarked way that it's making that process very much its own, and therefore leave NATO, that has been a big social media theme amongst the die-hard MAGAs in the last 24 hours. No signs yet that it's actually taking root in the administration. Trump so far has suggested the US remains committed to NATO, just that European countries need to step up. But we'll see just how much his new bestie Putin will be able to persuade him otherwise. On that front, Operation Best Mate continued apace. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered US Cyber Command to halt offensive operations against Russia. This is described as being part of a larger re-evaluation of all operations against Russia as part of an effort to draw President Putin into a new relationship with the United States. Now, that shouldn't be taken as unprecedented. Former officials suggest that it has been relatively common for pauses to be ordered in military operations when sensitive diplomacy is being conducted. What the Trump administration will be hoping in this case is likely to be something a little more enduring. They want Putin to see that the US is now so firmly on their side that they can reciprocate by dialing down the shadow war that it has been conducting against the US, with, for example, attempts of Russian hackers to penetrate US networks, carrying out ransomware attacks against essential infrastructure, and carrying out other sabotage attempts. What the administration is giving up with the ending of those cyber operations is the espionage that has formerly been used to seek to understand Vladimir Putin's intentions and his situation as he enters negotiations. In addition to this, the Trump administration has already begun to dismantle the work of the FBI and other agencies in seeking to track and counter Russian propaganda and disinformation. One might cynically suggest that such campaigns have generally gone with the grain of this administration's public messaging, so why would you want to get in the way? It's worth noting that this was not the spirit of the operation during Donald Trump's first term as president. He actually gave Cyber Command the power to carry out offensive cyber operations without his direct approval, including the attempt to probe Russia's electricity grid infrastructure. That was then, but no longer apparently. And then another sign of the rapidly changed world of possibilities being signalled by all of this. This time, not one that's sanctioned, at least not yet, by the administration. The Financial Times is reporting that a close friend of Vladimir Putin's is looking to engineer the restart of Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline to Europe, with the backing of US investors. The fact that something is even being contemplated gives you some sense of how much the gravity has shifted. So this is Matthias Waning, who until 2023 ran Nord Stream 2's parent company for Gazprom. His plan involved outreach to the Trump team via US businessmen, and officials say that prominent Trump administration officials are aware of this initiative. They see it as part of the push to rebuild relations with Moscow. One US-led consortium of investors has drawn up the outlines of a post-sanctions deal with Gazprom, and there have been other expressions of interest as well. Now, you'll recall that during his first term in office, President Trump strongly criticised Germany for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, saying that it left Europe vulnerable to Vladimir Putin. Can't say he was wrong about that. This time it suggested that by the insertion of trustworthy American investors into the middle of it, it would become a much more useful operation, one where Europe could get cheaper energy thanks to Trump and Putin's collective pinky promises, and some US investors get to collect money for essentially nothing very much at all, so everyone wins. The EU will not be queuing up for this, you would think. And it can't happen anyway until the US lifts sanctions on Russia. Russia would have to agree to resume the sales it cut off during the war to the EU, and for that it would probably demand an end to European sanctions. And then countries like Germany and others would have to persuade their parliaments and their people that making themselves vulnerable to Russian/American gas supplies is a much more splendid idea now that much more reliable Trump is back in the White House. Germany has just elected a brand new government, the coalition for which is still coming together. I don't think this is something that they are going to want to lead with. Also, while there may be interest, it's unlikely that any of the major US corporations are looking to dive back into the Russian market just yet. Businesses in capital-intensive industries like stability, because their investments are long-term. Disruptions like we've seen in the last 3 years end up costing them tens of billions of dollars. But it's an indicator of what Putin has been talking up. All of the potential economic benefits America can enjoy with its great soulmates in the Kremlin once this unpleasant Ukraine business has been brushed out of the way. This is what Starmer and Macron and Maloney are competing with their alternative peace process and their request for a US backstop that, let's face it, would not be looked upon as friendly by Vladimir Putin. Unlike the events of the last few days, which have been met ecstatically by the Kremlin. Reports are now that a potential Trump-Putin summit may be moved further into the fast track. A second meeting of the teams to follow up the Riyadh summit will also be following relatively quickly. This is all described by people like Secretary of State Marco Rubio as being what you have to do to bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. And this is really the central point and the problem for Europe and for Ukraine. Donald Trump wants the fighting to stop quickly. Doesn't much care about the basis for that, just that it happens, so that he can normalise relations, make more money, preferably get a Nobel Peace Prize in the process. Even the US isn't in a position where it can bully Russia to the table. But it can bully Ukraine. So the key to speed is to give Russia most of what it wants, bully Ukraine into accepting it. Oh, and don't forget to be thankful for it.
Thank you, sir. May I have another?
That is the only dynamic that Trump will see can end the conflict quickly in the way that most benefits America. So, of course, Zelensky is seen as a pain for insisting on justice for Ukraine as the country that was invaded. But there's no commercial benefit for the United States from Ukrainian justice. At least that's how it appears to Trump. Europe gains nothing by accepting this reality quickly. The longer it can persuade the various actors to at least keep up the pretense, the longer they might get to make preparations for the inevitable exposure. And you never know, a miracle might happen. But there is no incentive for the US in indulging such mechanics that I can see, so I'm not really expecting this is going to last long. I seriously hope I'm wrong, but I look at the rationale for the wishful thinking, and it doesn't fit the facts or the obvious motivations for the different players, nowhere near as well as this version. So we might as well get ready for it.